undergoing various trials at this time. So we want to remember them. If you have been with us on our last meeting, we had talked about how Eliphaz had told Job to acquaint himself with God and how God would lift him up. And we talked about what acquaintance with God meant. And we got to Job's reply to Eliphaz. And I want to just briefly try to get you to again see what Job is saying, because I think there's something here that if we can tap into it, that it will help us in the midst of a trial. And that's what the purpose of all of this is for us to have something that we can call up or hold on to in the middle of difficult circumstances. Here we have Job, and he's replying to Eliphaz when Eliphaz tells him he ought to acquaint himself with God. And Job says he can't find him. And what Job is really saying is look, I've been in this trial, and I've been looking for God to make my case so I can get God to lift his hand up off me. In other words, the trial that I'm going through is so difficult. I need God to lift his hand from me. And Job is a person that has had a good acquaintance with God. So he's accustomed to being able to call upon God. The Bible tells us that he got up early in the morning and he would give sacrifices for himself and his family just in case they might have sinned. So Job here now, I want you to try to understand his dilemma. He's calling to God to deliver him from his condition, but God is not answering. And this, remember I told you when I looked at this, it kind of brought a tear to my eye because I tried to put myself in Job's situation and wonder what it would be like if I was calling on God to help me, to deliver me, and God is not answering. See, Job feels like he's got nowhere to turn, and this is what he's saying. See, if I had a problem, if I was looking for Gordon, I could go to Gordon's house. I know where he lives. And I could camp out. If I go there and he's not home, I could camp out and I could bang on his door. I could say, Gordon, help me, let me in, help me. And I could stay there and I could bang on his door until he comes out. Either I just get on his nerves so bad he just got to come out. Huh? But see, what Job is saying, I don't know where to go. How do I find him? I go to the north, I don't know, I can't. I think he's not there. He said, where can I go to find God? And this is the question. Job is painting a picture for us is what it is like if God chose to turn his face away from us. See, this is what I want you to come in contact with. What is it like, or what would it feel like to you in the midst of your most difficult experience if God turned his face away from you? And this is what Job is going through. So he said, I need to find him so I can make my case. If I could just make my case, then God would see that his hand is too heavy upon me. And he perhaps would live. That's why he says, if he tried me, he'll find me righteous. Because Job wants this burden lifted from him. And so this is what he's going through. So now, but if you remember, Elihu had told Job this. He says, how much less then, Job, will he listen when you say you do not see him? He says, your case is before him, Job, and you must wait for him. Now, we talked about this, but this is what I want you to get to see. Elihu is telling him, Job, if you say that he's not listening to you, or you can't find him, he says, how do you expect him to listen to you? And this is what he's saying. Are you losing? God wants us to wait patiently for him. And that's what he said. This is what I want us to see, is that waiting is part of the trial. You with me? Waiting on God is part of the trial. If God came and rescued us as soon as we got into trouble, we cry out immediately in every circumstance and we never go through the trial. How many of you ever seen a parent that rushed every time their small child made a noise? And some of us who may be a little bit, I guess maybe say, tested in parenting, huh? We look at that individual and we may say, man, they spoiling that little rascal, huh? And they gonna spoil him. Every time he moves, they get up and they gotta rock him. You ever seen some people with the little baby, little bitty ones? As soon as they cry, they get up in the middle of the night and they start walking him up and down. Oh, I gotta walk him so he go back to sleep. Or they'll get up and they'll rock him back. What you doing? You training them, huh? Well, watch me call mama. Well, here come mama. See, you don't. I'm saying that, like that. But what I'm still saying is, you teaching the kid that the only way I can get to sleep, if I need some sleep, I need to cry, and mom's gonna come rock me to sleep. And I say mom, maybe it's a dad. But my point is, you know that the child is becoming overly dependent upon the parent in order for it to get to sleep. So what you have to do is you have to let the child cry a little while, huh? Get a little uncomfortable until he learns to go to sleep on his own. That's what the trial is. See, that's why God wants us to wait, but he wants us to wait patiently. Because this is the deal. I'm going to show you what the psalmist says. As we wait patiently, we're supposed to wait patiently with confidence, knowing that God is coming. Just as sure as the sun will rise, God is coming. And see, that's part of our trial. This is what I want to get to see. See, we can't get impatient in the trial. Look at what the psalmist said. The psalmist said, I remain confident of this. You see that? He says, I remain confident of this, that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. You see that? I'm just trying to get us to see. See, we have to have faith in that God is coming. Notice what Isaiah said. Most of us are familiar with this, but what I wanted you to see is how the nation of Israel, which was referred to as Jacob, went through the same thing. Notice what Isaiah says. He says, why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord? My cause is disregarded by my God. Can you see that? You see that? That sound familiar to Job? So he says, now this is after Job. But he says, now notice here. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. Now you see what Isaiah tells him? And this is what I'm trying to get us to see. See, these are the things that we have to understand and we have to take hold of when we're in the midst of the trial. And it seems as though to us that God is not responding. It's just like Elihu said. Elihu said, God sees your case, Job. He knows what you're going through, and he knows what your problems are. He sees your case. You just got to wait on the Lord. The Lord ain't going to move, Job, because you tired. But anyway, he says, look here. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. And see, when we get to the later part of this trial, God's going to show us that. That's part of what God is showing Job. But we'll get to that in a minute. He says, he gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Now see, this is what's supposed to happen. My first experience with God, as I learned patiently to wait on him, and I see God's hand work and deliver me from my circumstances, the next time I should have more confidence that God is going to come and deliver me. So see how the weak has been made strong. So now, even when I go to that next trial and I wait on the Lord, eventually I'm supposed to get to the point to where my faith is such that I can talk like the psalmist and say, I'm confident that God is coming. You with me? But anyway, Job's difficulties. How many of you remember the song? Of course, all of us should remember the song written by J.B. Coates. It's in our songbook. It's called Where Could I Go? That's what Job feels like. Huh? He's saying, where can I go? I'm living below in this old sinful world. Hardly a comfort can I afford. Striving alone, facing temptation sore. Where can I go but to the Lord? That's why Job said, I'm terrified. I can't find him, so I'm terrified. Because I know he has his hand on me, and I know what he can do to me. But I want to get to him and tell him, state my case. Lord, remove your hand from me. Anyway, so he says he gives strength to the weary, increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary. And we're familiar with this. And young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord, you see that? Will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. Now notice this. The strength comes not with youth, but with faith. Those who hope and trust in the Lord, those are the ones who get the strength. You don't have to be a young man. See, we ought to shout and rejoice over that, huh? You don't have to be young. Race is not given to the swift, right? So we ought to take hope in the fact that the Lord will give us strength if we wait on Him. But this is also why we ought to constantly study the Scriptures, so we'll have these things to hold on to in difficulty. Now, we're going to look at the final stage of the trial. And just like everything else, and as it will also be with us, God will have the last word. Now, we talked about how Elihu had come to God's defense in the pre-trial, right? And really, Elihu has silenced Job because Job has had nothing to say in response to Elihu. So Job really should not have gone to trial, because the pre-trial said to Job, you ain't got no case. But God, notice this, Job has accused God of treating him unfairly. In other words, of being unjust. So God, being the just God that He is, gives Job a chance to make his case. You see that? But he's going to have the last word. Now, Job, by virtue of the fact that he accuses God of treating him unjustly or unfairly, has really called God unjust. See, that's the problem with that. And this is why we have to be careful. Because see, if we say that God treats us unfairly, then we are really saying that God, just like Job, is unjust. And at the same time, what we're questioning is God's judgment. And so this is what these questions that God is fixing to rip on Job, that's what they're all about. This is what the questions are designed to do. And you note takers, take your notes, because I want you to look at these things when we mention each one of these questions. The questions that God is going to present to Job, and like I say all the time, this is really for any man who thinks that he can justify himself before God. And I'm going to show you something at the end of this lesson, and I'm not going to go through every question that God tells Job. We'd be here, that's like 5 chapters. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to show you enough to make the point. This is what I want you to understand or see. Take this note. These questions are designed to show Job's mortality and God's immortality. So God's fixing to show Job, okay, Job, since you question me, you question my judgment, Job, what qualifies you? Huh? And what God is fixing to do is make a contrast between him and Job and let Job see why he is incapable of questioning God. God's immortality against Job's mortality. God's omniscience against Job's ignorance. God's omnipotence against Job's impotence. That's what's going to be on display. So God is fixing to tell Job, or show Job, through a series of questions, why it is that he has no reason, or he's not even capable of questioning him. Now notice how we start off. the Lord answers Job out of a whirlwind. Now, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us the severity of this storm. But I know there was a prophet of God who wanted Elijah, he wanted to hear Job, or he wanted to hear God in a storm. In fact, God told him to go up to the mountain, right? And the Bible says that there was a whirlwind, right? And it broke the mountain and the rocks. But God was not in the wind, right? And after the wind, there came an earthquake. But God wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire. But God wasn't in the fire. That's in 1 Kings 19. And it says, but then after the fire, there was a small, still voice. And God spoke to him. So I don't know what this whirlwind is like. I don't know the severity of it, but I do know whirlwinds can cause some great damage. But the Bible doesn't tell us how severe this one is, but we see God speaking to Job out of this whirlwind. And I don't know, I can only imagine, and all of us can really only imagine what this must be like to Job, to talk to God out of a whirlwind. And God says, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? And we talked about that already, right? God is saying, see, light is associated with knowledge, right? And darkness is associated with ignorance or lack of knowledge. Huh? So now he says, who is this that darkeneth counsel, right? You're not, what counsel can you give? You don't have no knowledge. So watch what God does. Now, this is what Job is really, and this is what any man would be doing. I'm just going to show you the mortality part. Because what God is asking, though, in one sense, when he gets to the stuff about where were you, he's showing Job, he says, Job, you hadn't been alive but this long. Now, if you can see some light between my fingers to eternal God, that's about how long that Job has been alive. He said, Job, you ain't been you hadn't been alive long enough. How is it possible, Job, that a person like you that's been around this long can compare to a God that's always been and always will be? That's the first instance of this thing. But you're going to see this reflected in a lot of the questions. But that's my point. So right there off of that, straight off, that lets you know Job has no way. That's like a small child just coming into the world telling you what to do. Just like that small child can't do it, this is what God's looking at. He said, Job, what position are you in, Job, to tell me something? And like I said, if you can think that little baby that's just out of his mother's womb can start instructing you on what to do, then you'll be in the same position that Job is. And this is what God is trying to illustrate for us. But anyway, look at here. He said, Job, what I want you to do is gird up your loins like a man. The NIV, I believe, says brace yourself. Brace yourself, Job, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Now, that when he says, I will demand of thee, that means I'm finna ask you some questions. Job, I'm finna ask you some questions. And I want you to answer. Since you so smart, Job, you gonna question my judgment, Job? You think you know more than me, Job, about how to run the affairs of men? Well, let me ask you a few questions, Job. Since you so smart. Where was you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? Now this implies two things. First one is what I was telling you. Job, you wasn't around. And Job, since you did witness, and I want you to take this for modern day science too. Because this can apply to any man. I don't care what kind of instruments they got. See, we get this mixed up. And I'm going to show you some stuff in science. I've told you this before, but I'm going to tell you some more stuff. And I'm going to try to illustrate it for you about modern science and what science exactly is. But anyway, notice this. He says, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the world? In other words, Job, you wasn't there at the beginning. Since you wasn't there, Job, I didn't need your advice. I didn't get no advice from you, Job. Nor did I need it. Because guess what? The foundation of the earth is laid, Job. Didn't need your advice. You wasn't there, Job. So how can you even know and understand anything about the foundation of the earth? But he said, well, wait, Job. Declare if you have some understanding. So no way Job can declare he got some understanding. Because he wasn't there. And that's the point that God is making. See, that's what I'm talking about. Mortality, immortality, right? Omniscience, ignorance. Yes, sir.
There's a literal translation when he mentions words without knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Empty talk. That's good. That's a good one. And this was a lot of stuff. We'll get to this in a minute. Let me show you something. He said, look here. Who laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? In other words, who measured the earth? Who determined, Job? It's like an architect designing a building, right? He's saying, who laid the measures, Job? Who figured out how big it ought to be? If thou knowest, he said, who stretched the line upon it? Who was able to stretch a line, Job? Did you stretch the line, Job? Again, God is saying, I didn't need your advice, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth. Genesis 1 and 2 says, in the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form, or was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. So in the beginning, Elohim, and that's what we talked about before, that God had no one to consult with. So he consulted with himself, which is Elohim. So God consults with himself. And this is what God is saying too. He's showing his sovereignty. It's by me alone. I exist because of myself, and I created all things for myself, by myself. So now, he says, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, and who laid the cornerstone thereof? And what God is doing is he's using the creation, and I'm going to show you what the creation. You remember when God made the creation, he says, he looked at it and he said, it's all good. God is trying to illustrate to Job, if you can't understand the elementals of the foundation, you can't dare question me concerning the affairs of men. But notice, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. This was child's play. He spoke them into existence. 6 days. But he handled the affairs of men over generations. From the foundation of the world, he had already declared, he had looked down before the world was founded and decided that he was going to send Jesus Christ to redeem man from his transgression. So he had already knew all this, right? But he notice how the Bible tells us, in the fullness of time, right? God brought forth his son. You see that? So God waited till the time was right? Now who was God working with all that time? Sinful man. Paul tells us that the law was instituted so that man, right, would recognize that he needed saving. So God, all this time, is working with sinful man. Man got so wicked in the beginning, in Genesis, in 6, God had to destroy it all, right? But he found grace in Noah. And that's what we've been talking about, how grace is present, right? And how without God's grace, we don't stand a chance. But one of the things that I think that dilutes us from being fascinated and marveled by God's creation and perhaps having the arrogance, so to speak, as Job, because many of us, we don't want to follow God's commands or judgments, right? And we should, if we understand exactly who God is. We are not ever questioning the word he says and whatever he tells us to do. We ought to know that there's no way our knowledge can compare or our wisdom can even compete and just fall down and do it, right? But we don't do that, right? So in a sense, we are fighting against God. Against God, we're saying that we're smarter, right? But one of the things that I think that hurts us is modern science. See, because modern science, and I told you this before, not necessarily modern science, just really science in general, but modern science in particular, since this is the era that we live in. Science cannot see God. Can't see him. So it will never acknowledge God, and it will never tell us that there's a God. When you look at science, all things that science eventually conclude is that these things just occurred or they've always been, right? So because they can't see God, they'll never get to the point and say, you know what, something had to. No, that's not going to happen. Someone, the design is too intelligent. No, you're not going to get that from science. It's just these things either always have been or they just happen. Now understand this. This is what I want to show you. Science is always limited. And I probably don't have enough time to get through this, but anyway. Science is always limited by man's understanding of what he sees. First of all, science is the observation of naturally occurring phenomena. That is the definition of science. I don't care what nobody tells you. That is the definition of science. It is the observation of naturally occurring phenomena. So actually man is looking at things that God has done. They're looking and studying the works of God. But notice this. I just want to show you how man is limited by what he observes. What are you talking about, Brother Wilson? I'm going to show you this slide right here. There was a guy by the name of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton came along in the late 1600s. And y'all heard the story. He was sitting under an apple tree. Now, some folks say the apple hit him on the head, but that's not true. The apple did not hit him on the head, but he did watch the apple fall to the earth. Now, his observation of that, Isaac Newton, some say, discovered gravity, but that's really not true because this is my point. Isaac Newton is really the first person to do a comprehensive, or to put together in writing, a comprehensive theory about gravity. Now notice what I just said. A comprehensive theory. Okay? But Sir Isaac Newton's theory remained in place until somebody else could come along with a better theory. And notice, Isaac Newton's theory was really just what he built upon from his knowledge of what Galileo and some of the others before him had saw. So what I'm trying to show you is the inconsistency of science. It's always been that way. Always. Don't let nobody tell you any different. There's always the theory, and that theory stays as in place until somebody else comes along with a better theory. Isaac Newton's theory, now what he said when he saw that apple fall to earth, he said, you know what? The earth has a force that pulls objects to its center. And they determined that all objects that had mass had this force that it would pull things toward its center. And he took a ball and he threw it, and he saw that ball, how it went out and it came to earth. Okay, now Einstein gonna do the same thing, but Einstein comes up with a different theory. Anyway, so he looks at that and he says, you know what? If I could throw that ball hard enough, then it would just stay where it's at. He looked at gravity like if you took a ball and put it on a string and you spent it around, because of the speed, it would just stay at the same distance all the way. And that's the way he kind of saw gravity. The earth is pulling it to it, this object toward it, but unless it can break free from the earth's gravitational pull. I mean, you've heard that. Y'all probably, now if y'all was in science like I was in science when I was a little young boy at Oakdale Elementary School, they told us, Isaac Newton, that was the theory that was approached us with Isaac Newton, and they say the earth has a gravitational pull. You remember that? Well, Einstein comes along in the 1900s. That's about 200 and some odd years that Isaac Newton's theory remains in place. But Einstein comes along. Einstein says, wait a minute. He says, there's not a pool that's bringing, the earth doesn't have a pool. He says what it is, he noticed that ball, and how that ball, when it was thrown, how it would meet with the curvature, how it fell to the earth similar to a curvature of the earth. And he says, guess what? He says, that is a curvature of space. And Einstein, even though he was brilliant, believe it or not, he was not all that good in math. And so Einstein had postulated some theory in math as to how there was this space-time continuum, because he figured out that if you really want, see, we thought the world was in 3 dimensions, length, height, and depth. So, but Einstein said, wait a minute, there's a 4th dimension. And he looked at objects in space. Like, how many of y'all familiar with plotting the X and Y axis in school? Okay, if you plotted the X and Y axis, if I want to locate this in a 2-dimensional plane, I would say this object is so far in the X direction and is so far in the Y direction. Y'all remember that in school, plotting on an axis? Never. Okay, we never shot a point. But anyway, my point is, okay, what Einstein says, well, wait a minute, what if that object sits out here? That's the 3rd dimension. And he looked at the objects in space, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is how we got a man to the moon. He says, if I want to locate an object in space, I not only have to know where it's located, length, height, and depth, he says, I need to know what time it's located. And that's the 4th dimension. So he said there is a space-time curvature. And he came up with, see, if you look at this thing here, you can see how that there is a curvature of space as you get close to the sun. And these objects, like the earth, every object makes a deformation of space. It deforms space to some degree. Now, as long as an object is outside of this critical deformation of space, it's affected by this sun, but if it gets too far in here, then it eventually pulls in all the way. But in Einstein, so Einstein said there's a curvature of space that makes these things. In other words, if you had a belt, how many of you ever had a belt? Like your dad used to take the belt and pop it? Pop, pop. Okay, if you put an object in between that belt and you pulled it, that belt would curve around that object. Well, he said that space, see, is pushing down or trying to push down on the object. So when you throw an object, it goes down. Why? Because space is pushing it down. Now, they couldn't prove Einstein's theory. And what happened is a mathematician comes along, and he says, wait a minute, Einstein. He says, there's a problem with your theory. He says, in order for your theory to be correct, there has to be a force somewhere in the universe that's so strong that it has to approach near infinity. Well, understand, remember what I told you science was, right? It's man's ability to observe. They didn't have no instruments like we have now, right? And in Isaac Newton's day, they didn't have the instruments we have now. But what I want you to see is in Job's day, they had literally nothing. And this is what I want you to see here too. This is my point for this exercise. It's not exercise in science. What I'm trying to show you is how the Bible is telling us most of these things that science is now discovering in modern science with their instruments. Okay. And I'm trying to show you the inconsistency of science throughout the generations of men. How it has constantly changed and constantly changed with man's ability to observe and his understanding of what he observes. See, because he can see a thing and not really understand what he's looking at. So anytime you go to science, I'm just trying to see, you have taken your confidence away from God and put it in man. And what, like Dr. Evans used to say, good science and the Bible agrees. Bad science and the Bible will not agree. Well, what's your point? Job said, look at Job. He says he stretches out the north, and the north he's talking about is the sky. He says, over an empty space, and hangeth the earth on nothing. Now let me show you what happened with Einstein. Going back to my thing around, I'm going to have to close a minute running down. This mathematician says to Einstein, he says, there has to be some force somewhere that's exerting so much, and where the gravitational pull is so strong, it approaches infinity. Well, Einstein couldn't figure that out. No other scientists today could figure it out. So they laughed and mocked at Einstein. His theory of relativity was kind of laughed at, mocked at, and everything. Well, what happened? Well, modern day comes along, right? We get all smart, we can send satellites out into space. And the way they want to prove to see whether or not there's a curvature of space is if you shoot a light beam, a concentrated light beam, like this. See how that light beam? That light beam travels through space in a straight line. They say, well, if there's curvature of space, if we come out to the side of the earth at the right time, when we can see it, if we shoot close by the earth, then that curvature of space, instead of that light going straight, it ought to bend. So they shined it, and guess what it did? It bent. So that's how they behave. There is a curvature of space. Einstein was on something. Now, I'm going to close. How many of you heard all the hoopla they make over the black hole? I mean, all kind of hoopla over the black hole. But guess what the black hole represents? The black hole represents that spot in space that exerts some pressure and this is the point. Now, in order for this, our earth, according to modern science, so all this is based on according to modern science. I'm just showing you where the Bible was way ahead of these guys. But now look here. According to modern science, the only way for this, see this little space in here? In order for this to be bridged, as long as nothing comes in and influences this space, then the earth will remain this distance from the sun. Some object larger than the earth has to come into this space and influence it in order for the earth to move. I'm just trying to get you to see how God's got these things in nothing. You with me? Thank you. I'll go ahead.
We appreciate that lesson. Then that dissertation on science. Einstein was just a little bit better in math than me. But Newton and that other guy were mathematicians. But in all of that, the preacher said,